Hello and welcome to Philosophy of Psychology Week 5, and in this lecture we're going to look at empathy and moral motivation. And moral motivation, again, as we'll see, uses the dual process theory, and we're going to talk about the role of emotion, specifically empathy, in sort of motivating, in providing the right moral motivation so that we can go from understanding or idea to practice and to action. So it's that transition that's at stake in moral motivation. Let's talk about the idea of motivation, and then we'll get into some of the studies about empathy that have been done to kind of shed light on the role that motivation, empathy and emotion in particular, plays in moral motivation. So in the history of philosophy, many moral theories focus on the idea of motivation as the essential moral aspect of an action. In other words, it's the idea of the intention, or what motivates the action, what the person is sort of trying to achieve as the essential aspect of the essential moral aspect of the action. Sometimes you could focus on sort of character or consequences, or as utilitarianism does. But some moral theories, they tend to be called deontological, focus on motivation or intention as the sort of the essential moral aspect of the act. So what motivates the action? And Kant, Immanuel Kant, an influential modern philosopher, argued that an action only has moral worth if it's motivated by a sense of duty. In other words, for Kant, I must do it simply because it is right. And Kant distrusted any kind of emotion where you sort of, whether you feel sympathy or empathy, or any kind of emotional reaction as of moral worth. And that was because Kant felt that emotions were unreliable. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not, but we can't sort of base our right conduct, what we do, on something that sort of comes and goes, that is not sort of in our control, whether it's there or not. So Kant thought the idea of doing something because of our sense that it's right is a far more stable motive, one that we don't have to worry about it not being there, sort of not appearing at the right time. So a lot of theories focus on motivation. So we're going to look at the idea of empathy and why it's seen by many to be a powerful motive. So it's often assumed that empathy is a powerful motivation to moral action. And it makes sense to think that it competes with two other motivational forces more hostile to morality, let's say indifference and self-interest. So we might think that empathy competes with indifference when we think about what we know in its cognition, what we would call its sort of epistemic role of empathy, by alerting us to circumstances that demand moral attention. If we're empathetic, we're going to be alerted to those sort of moral circumstances. We're going to see those circumstances in the environment. Whereas if we're sort of, if our affect is indifferent, we're less likely to be able to recognize. In its motivational role, it serves perhaps as a corrective to self-interest. If you think that self-interest is often a sort of a major motivator for us, as something that sort of conditions a lot of the things we do, and we might think of empathy as acting as a kind of counter to indifference, a kind of way of sort of overcoming the barrier of indifference. So with empathy, we can sort of correct that focus and sort of direct our actions to the good of others rather than our self-interest. So empathy is sort of seen as this powerful moral motivator. So when we talk about empathy, we mean it's an affective state, it's an emotional state, and it can be distinguished from cognitive empathy. So cognitive empathy is mind reading skills, being able to know to be aware of what other people are thinking and feeling. So you can have that sort of cognitive empathy. You can sort of have good mind reading skills. You can be aware of what people are feeling, what they're what they're going through, but yet you don't sort of actively empathize with them. So that's often assumed to be the nature of a psychopathy. And for people with this psychopathy, the mind reading capacity seems to be intact, but they appear to lack the ability to share or to be effectively attuned to the emotions of others. And that's why they're often able to sort of deceive and manipulate people. So they have the cognitive empathy without the kind of affective empathy that actually sort of motivates us to care about other people. So empathy is that affective state that's not just an awareness, but is sort of has a kind of emotion that motivates us to care about other people's suffering and to want to alleviate it as well. Okay, so if we think of the forms of empathy here, we can distinguish three different kinds. So we talked about affective empathy, the ability to respond to other people's emotions appropriately. That's when we have the cognitive piece, the cognitive empathy. We can understand them, but we can also sort of respond in a sort of caring way, and we can sort of respond affectively to people's emotions. So those two, we were just talking about the affective empathy and the cognitive empathy, the distinction between those two. The other kind of empathy we might distinguish is somatic empathy. And this simply means the ability to feel what another person is feeling. So here's the thing, that in a typical case of affective empathy, it's sort of felt that what we're feeling is a negative emotion in response to another person's suffering. So we feel bad that another person is suffering. We feel bad because something bad is happening to another person. So in the idea of somatic empathy, this is developed into an idea of qualitative similarity, qualitative sameness, or congruence. So here what we feel is qualitatively the same as what the other person feels, which Batson calls feeling as another feels. So the first sense of affective empathy is a kind of empathetic concern, and it might be a kind of negative reaction to another person's suffering, but it's not quite, doesn't quite go to the extent of somatic empathy, which is the idea that we're feeling the same thing as the other person is feeling, that there's a qualitative similarity, a qualitative congruence. Right? We can feel bad for another person without necessarily feeling what they're feeling. So there are different understandings and different really different ideas about which of these is sort of most necessary for empathy. Some people say we need a kind of somatic empathy. A lot of people just focus on this idea of affective empathy. So let's talk about the empathy altruism hypothesis. And this comes from research by Batson in the mostly in the 1990s. I think a lot of these studies were done, and the idea is that a behavior is altruistic if it's motivated by a desire with the ultimate goal of increasing another's welfare. And that's the sort of core idea of altruism, to sort of care about other people rather than ourselves. So it's motivated by an actual desire whose goal is increasing other people's welfare. And to say it's the ultimate goal means that you must desire another's welfare for its own sake. So it's not instrumental in achieving other goals, but it's the final goal to which this action is dedicated. So without having this goal, the action wouldn't take place. So that's what we mean by ultimate. So somebody might give to charity, for example, but do so in order to win the approval of others, or perhaps to be perceived as generous and giving. Right? So if those are the motivations, then the goal of increasing another's welfare isn't the ultimate desire or the ultimate goal. So that desire must be the ultimate goal for something to count as altruistic. So There are some arguments against altruism that have been proposed which purport to claim that altruism is actually impossible, that it's not something we're capable of. So if we take these in turn, there's simply the idea that people act on the basis of their own desires. And because everybody just acts on the basis of their own desires, it's impossible for us to sort of act altruistically, to act on the basis of desire for another person's welfare. But I think that fails to distinguish the subject of desire and who the desire is about. Right? The subject of the desire is me, I'm the one desiring. But there's also the question of who the desire is about. Whose well-being does it aim at? So when we desire to give money to starving children and our desire is satisfied, we feel good. But this does not show the concern for the children is not the core motivation, right? The feeling good about oneself may be a byproduct of the action. And that also, we can see that also in number 2. People always feel some pleasure when their desire is satisfied. But of course, that pleasure may be a byproduct. It's not necessarily the goal or the sort of ultimate, what our desire is ultimately aiming at. So feeling good about oneself is a kind of byproduct of the action, not the actual goal of the action itself. So we don't need to accept the second one either. The third one about natural selection has made us focus on our own survival. Therefore, altruism is impossible for us because we've been programmed to sort of focus on our own survival. I think that's a mistaken way of thinking about natural selection. Is the main thing that's wrong with it. That actually survival is increased by cooperation, and that's something that's been sort of found in the way different species and groups actually sort of operate. That cooperation is a central mechanism for survival, and many species exemplify this. So it's not. So to say it's made us focus on our own survival is far too narrow, because part of that is the survival of the group that we're attuned to, and our sort of our natural instinct for cooperation sort of expresses that idea. So one problem we're going to encounter in this link between altruism and empathy is the problem of aversive arousal. And the question is whether behavior that's induced by empathy is genuinely altruistic. Is it genuinely aimed at the good of another person? So the idea of aversive arousal is that by witnessing someone suffering, people feel a distressing and negatively valenced emotion. It's uncomfortable to sort of witness somebody suffering. It's uncomfortable to witness somebody in pain. And we get that sort of distressing negative emotion. Now, the aversive arousal hypothesis says that this means that the motivation for the action may be to relieve our own suffering, our own sort of empathetic distress, rather than the suffering of the person who's the target. And of course, this is in the sort of Abraham Lincoln example that's talked about in the chapter. Right? Was he doing it because he sort of couldn't bear the fact of couldn't live with himself if he didn't help, or was it genuinely for the good of the creatures he was helping? So there's that. This raises the issue aversive arousal of what our motivation actually is. Is it to lessen our own distress, or is it actually to relieve the suffering of another person? In this context, the Elaine experiment was seen as helping us think about this question of aversive arousal. So to test whether aversive arousal is in fact the motivation, participants in the Elaine experiment were given the chance to escape from helping Elaine, which would satisfy the aversive arousal hypothesis but not empathy. So the idea is that if you can give participants a chance to sort of escape, that will lessen their own sort of negative suffering, their own sort of negative affect. But of course, it won't help Elaine. So if the motivation is genuinely to help another person, then escape shouldn't be an option. Elaine was given a fictitious electric shocks, and the participants were sort of given the option of taking her place. So to sort of, or they were given the option of sort of escaping, of sort of not witnessing and not seeing what was happening to Elaine. Now, when participants saw themselves as similar to the victim, the ease of escape didn't reduce the likelihood of helping Elaine. And so this seems to suggest that it's not actually aversive arousal they're looking for. It's actually helping somebody else, because escaping would sort of allow them to reduce the aversive arousal as well. But of course, it wouldn't help Elaine. So it's only by choosing that option and sort of rejecting the option of escape that you can separate the two motivations, the motivation of aversive arousal and the motivation of helping another person or alleviating another person's suffering. One thing I think it's worth mentioning here is the difference between what we might call synchronic and diachronic empathetic motivation. So instead of thinking of empathy as always present when we act altruistically, we can think of it as playing an indispensable role in the development of moral motivation. Right? Almost like with empathy, you're sort of learning a habit. But when you learn the habit, you don't need the emotion anymore, because it's ingrained and you just do it naturally. It's sort of you become habituated to it. So the idea here is that empathy is not sort of, we shouldn't think of it as synchronic. In other words, it's always present when we make a moral judgment. We should think of it as diachronic. In other words, it plays a role over time in building up our sort of our moral motivation. But once it's there, we don't sort of need it to we don't need to feel that sort of sense of alleviating other suffering, because it's just become part of our habit. So it's present in our formation, and then it's once that formation has taken place, it's not needed. So by the time we're capable of mature moral judgment, empathy on this idea has already done the work of conditioning our responses so that we don't have to feel the emotion every time. Once habituation has taken place, the emotion is no longer needed. And again, psychopathic personality disorder, we might think of here, has been linked to the failure to lay down these empathetic associations in the first place. So what the sort of psychopathic personality lacks is that sort of habituation of laying down those empathetic markers, of sort of having them in place so that you can respond with sort of mature moral judgment. And that's why sort of those with this pathology fail to respond to moral transgressions with the appropriate emotions. So that gives us a sort of insight into maybe how this psychopathology works, and gives us a different way of thinking about empathy as sort of something that's necessary for habituation, but it's not necessarily once we've sort of grown into our sort of mature moral judgments and we sort of act on a stable kind of ideas that have been sort of habituated. Okay, so the second hypothesis, besides the empathy altruism hypothesis, which we've sort of tentatively endorsed, the empathy benefit hypothesis says that empathy-induced behavior has morally and socially desirable consequences. So before we sort of tackle this hypothesis, there's obviously the philosophical issue here of how we define morally and socially desirable consequences. And one way of thinking about this is to take a broadly utilitarian position, which, remember, focuses on the greatest happiness of the greatest number, or the idea of maximizing well-being. So to challenge the empathy benefit hypothesis, we would have to find cases where the benefits of empathy are morally questionable, taking this sort of broad utilitarian approach, where empathy does not in fact maximize well-being, but sort of has consequences which are sort of not morality, or sorry, which are not sort of welfare maximizing, but actually lead to a sort of suboptimal outcome that would be better if empathy wasn't present. So that's the question, whether we can think of empathy as having desirable consequences, maximizing well-being in this sense. Now, there's a couple of biases which have been proposed and which are said to apply to empathy, and which make this empathy benefit hypothesis questionable. The first one is the near and dear bias. And the idea here is that we are more likely to feel empathy for those who are close to us and resemble us. And often this will lead us to act in ways that don't maximize the general happiness. So the problem here is that we're giving priority to what is near and dear to us, because that's where our empathy really that's where it's focused. But as a result of that, we're not actually maximizing happiness. So, for example, we are more likely to give money to someone we know, or someone in our community, or our community itself when it's suffering, than people on the other side of the world. When in fact, giving to people we don't know might lead to greater happiness if they're suffering more, if they're sort of more deprived than the people we're seeking to help, who are close to us. So that's the sort of near and dear bias, that we're more likely to focus on people we know and our own community, and in doing so we're not actually maximizing happiness. We're just sort of prioritizing those people we can identify with, and we're more likely to identify with people who look like us, who live near to us, who talk like us, etc. So a second bias we can think of that may apply to empathy is the identifiable victim bias. And here the issue is that it's much easier to respond with empathy to individual and identifiable victims who suffer than to merely statistical lives and their losses. Stalin's well-known quote sums this up quite nicely. If one man dies of hunger, that's a tragedy. If 1 million die, that's a statistic. Right? So it's hard for us to feel compassion for groups, especially large groups, but it's easy for us to feel compassion for identifiable individuals. So that may, again, so the identifiable victim bias may lead us to act in ways through our empathy that don't actually maximize happiness. So, for example, we might be more inclined to empathize with one patient who suffers from, a particularly a terrible disease, as opposed to a whole group of people who will suffer because of the lack of funds for healthcare in a particular jurisdiction, right? So do we give money to this one patient, or do we give money to a healthcare system to allow a number of sort of patients in that system to keep receiving care? Well, you can donate money to a girl to allow her to enjoy her last Christmas, or you can donate money to hospitals, say in Massachusetts, to prevent healthcare deterioration, right? So obviously our empathy is gonna be triggered more easily by the case of the girl who wants to enjoy her last Christmas, but that's not necessarily the sort of morality or welfare maximizing choice, and therefore not necessarily the choice that brings the most moral benefits. It's just the case where our empathy is focused. So we're more likely to sort of focus on individual cases than sort of bigger cases, or to empathize with collectives who are suffering rather than individuals. Now, one suggestion is that by taking a disinterested perspective, we can save the empathy benefit hypothesis. Right, so the idea is, and this was Adam Smith's proposal, that we take an impartial spectator's point of view. So we try and sort of be impartial and take a sort of bird's eye spectator's point of view, and try to sort of look at benefit and sort of look at our empathy through that lens. Now, the problem here is that being impartial may destroy the motivation of empathy itself. Once we're sort of taken out of those ties we have to people that are often the trigger for empathy, we may no longer be strongly motivated to help. So it takes away the sort of motivation to help in taking away that sort of those sort of relations. So it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. Now, another strategy is to say that the empathy benefit hypothesis is correct in spite of its biases. And this is the biting the bullet strategy. So here you admit that those biases apply to empathy, but you say nonetheless it's still correct. In other words, it still leads to sort of general welfare and the greatest well-being. It still maximizes happiness in spite of those biases. So the first claim is that focusing on those close to us does actually maximize general happiness. So most people can do the most, it says, most people can do the most to maximize happiness by caring for people around them and caring for people close to them. One question we can ask is, this perhaps may have been true when our sort of awareness of the rest of the world and our chances of sort of travel and affecting things in faraway places was much lower than it is today. But is it still true today? It seems like we can more easily make a difference in other people's lives today. And that might be a sort of problem for that hypothesis that focusing on those close to us is always or perhaps often the right thing to do. The second claim says that we have stronger moral obligations to those who are close to us. So that's a plausible sounding idea, because we often think that we have obligations towards our own children that are different to our obligations towards other people's children. We have obligations to our own family that are perhaps different to others. So it's natural that we have stronger moral obligations to those we feel close to. And that's what empathy is reflecting. Empathy is sort of reflecting those stronger ties that we have to family and people who are close to us. One of the problems with this claim, though, is that it's a bit problematic when we say, those close to us, who do we mean in that case? And in fact, when we talk about our family and stuff, we might think that that's reasonable because we all have families and so on. It's slightly different if we think of it in terms of caring about our own ethnic group or our own sort of racial group. And here we should think about why that would be relevant to moral obligation, because usually we don't think of those kind of ties, those kind of ideas of closeness, somebody who's ethnically close to us, as relevant to moral obligation. We think of those things as irrelevant, that our moral obligations are to human beings. So it's not clear that this objection can that this proposal can overcome those objections, that there are some When we think of those who are close enough, there are some morally questionable ways that we can interpret that phrase. Some people have suggested that there are other moral emotions as well. Jesse Prince is one that suggests anger as a possible motivation. We could think maybe anger is vulnerable perhaps to the same biases as empathy, in the sense that it tends to focus on what's close to us, what happens to us on an individual basis, rather than sort of being angry about collective sort of things that hurt people as a larger group. But it's interesting. I think he claims that this kind of righteous anger was the motivation for, say, the civil rights movement, which brought about a lot of change on its sort of moral idea of human equality and opposition to racism. And it seems that you could say that the movement was driven more by this idea of sort of righteous anger rather than empathy. But when it comes down to it, perhaps anger is going to be sort of subject to the same biases. Some people focus on reason as the kind of the moral motivation, sort of moral motivating force. And the question with reason is always, is it sufficiently motivating? Can it do that job of motivating us? And we've seen in this course already previously, we've got understandings of reason as a kind of after effect of our sort of emotional reasoning, where reason kind of rationalizes what's happening but isn't actually a kind of decisive intervening player. So that if we take that sort of view of reason, then we think of it as kind of as weak in terms of its capacity to sort of move us and motivate us to act. Okay, so this week we've looked at dual process theory and the way it applies to moral motivation and moral judgment. And as we've seen, the kind of two processes, the fast and slow, the unconscious and the deliberate processes here are emotion on the one hand and reason, kind of deliberative reason about situations on the other. So we've talked about these processes and how they might interact and how they might kind of, which one is effective, which one is perhaps not so important. There's another kind of question we can ask here about the way we've set out this issue and the way we've looked at the dual process theory. We can ask what happens if we see these processes as working together rather than competing or in conflict. As we saw in the annotation, Jamil Zaki makes that kind of point about emotion and reason, that maybe we can sort of develop them together. They sort of work together to increase our sense of sort of moral insight. So what does this mean? So how can we sort of see these processes as working together? Well, let's take a couple of examples and see if these sort of examples are persuasive as we sort of think about how this works. The first one is about an aspect where our emotion changes and then our reasoning changes to catch up with our emotion. And the example that is often used here is the example of changing attitudes on gay relationships, LGBTQ relationships, and changing attitudes towards gay marriage. And there's a theory that these changing attitudes came about because of this sort of emotional connection. In other words, people saw other people they knew, their friends, colleagues, people in their family, who were bravely coming out and being sort of publicly gay people. And by seeing that, people sort of developed, it was first an emotional thing. Oh, these are my friends, these are my colleagues, these are people I like, these are people I identify with, these are my friends. So that sort of emotional process kind of changed people's attitudes. And then what happened was that reason started to catch up and people started to make the kind of rational arguments for gay marriage, right? It's it's the same. It's the same as traditional marriage. It's just a different sort of arrangement, but it's sort of the same thing, and it respects all of the tradition of marriage and so on. So people got into these rational arguments, having perhaps made the emotional transition, and then it's a case of reason trying to sort of catch up with that emotional change. Okay, so a different example where we might see the process working in the other direction, where we start with a kind of a sort of rational argument that gets accepted, and then our emotion catches up. An example that people have used here is smoking, cigarette smoking. And the argument is that we became persuaded that cigarette smoking was bad through rational arguments. In other words, people saw all of the evidence about lung disease, lung cancer, death, and they concluded that smoking was dangerous to health. So that was a kind of rational acceptance that yes, smoking is bad. Yes, we have to pass laws to sort of minimize it to, so that it's not an attractive thing, so that less people smoke. So that was the rational part. But over time, it seems like what happened is that our emotions kind of caught up. They caught up with our rational insight. Over time, people have sort of changed from seeing smoking as sort of acceptable to seeing it in emotional terms as kind of, people think it's disgusting, it's horrible, it's smelly, it's nasty. All of these sort of emotional reactions have now grown up to sort of match our rational insight that smoking is bad for us. And it's taken a bit of time for our emotion to kind of catch up with that. But now, for not everybody, but for a lot of people, when they smell a cigarette smoke, they see people smoking, they have this emotional, visceral kind of reaction of disgust as well, as though our emotion has kind of caught up with our rational thinking. So those are the kind of things I'm talking about here. Can we see the processes as working together, both in judgment and in motivation, rather than competing or in conflict? And if you look at the articles that I've posted this week, in the week 5 module, the articles by Helion and Pizarro, by Hannah Reid, and by Dario Cecchini, they give us a sense of how these processes might work, of how we might see this coming together, this sort of working together rather than sort of being in conflict or sort of competing. Maybe there's more kind of unity among these processes than we've been led to believe thus far. So I think that's an interesting idea, and we'll try and sort of pursue that and think about that in the assignments this week.